I'm going to read a chapter out of the book Witness, the autobiography of John Bennett. John Bennett was someone who served in the military and then met P.D. Uspensky and eventually found himself at Fontainebleau with Gurdjieff. And this chapter is called With Gurdjieff at Fontainebleau. I went to Fontainebleau alone. Mrs. Beaumont did not come because she felt an obligation to go to Dax, near Biarritz, to join her mother, who was taking a cure. As I wrote to her every day and she kept the letters, I am able to reconstruct my stay at the Prieuré more exactly than some other parts of my life. So very much happened to me that if I had relied on my memory alone, I could not believe that I was there only 33 days. I arrived tired and timid. Many stories were current in the London group of the hardships of life at the Prieuré. Orage, the journalist and critic, the intellectual par excellence, who had never used his hands for labor, had developed powerful muscles and the hard skin of the peasant or fisherman. Maurice Nicole, the psychoanalyst, abandoning his admiring following in Harley Street, had turned into a laborer and his wife into a housemaid. Wealthy, entitled members of Uspensky's group had gone over and had been astonished to find themselves enjoying work as scullery maids. I felt myself singularly unfitted for such a life, but I felt an absolute need to break out of the spiritual prison into which I had fallen. The Prieuré had changed much in the 8 months since my previous visit. The study house had been completed, and work had been started on a Russian bath. The study house had acquired an atmosphere that reminded me of the Mevlevi Teki outside the Adrianople gate of Istanbul. This was only the first impression. Very soon one began to feel that it was Gurdjieff and nothing but Gurdjieff. About 100 feet long and 40 wide, it had a deep stage at one end and a low gallery 10 or 12 feet broad surrounding a space where the pupils sat round on cushions on the earth floor. Facing the stage were 2 boxes partly hidden by curtains, in which Gurdjieff's wife, Madame Ostrowska, used to sit and watch the exercises. At the corners were fountains, and the windows were painted by hand to imitate stained glass. All through, the building had an impromptu air about it, more like a stage set than a permanent structure, and yet its character was so strong and so distinctive that no one who entered could withstand its influence. I arrived on a Saturday night, when the exercises were performed in the same white costumes I had seen in Constantinople, and visitors from Paris were allowed to watch the performance. The exercises consisted of the same rhythmic movements and ritual dances that I had seen before. There were also various demonstrations of telepathic communication that much impressed me at the time. Later I was shown the tricks by which the results were obtained. There were 25 or 30 Russians, and about as many English visitors. There were no French or Americans at that time, and between the Russians and English there was very little contact, chiefly owing to difficulties of language. I was fortunate in this respect. When I arrived, Madame de Hartmann received me in an elegant drawing room on the ground floor of the chateau, and told me that Georgy Ivanitch, the name by which Gurdjieff was known among the Russians, would see me the same afternoon. Speaking Turkish, we had no need of an interpreter. He asked for news of Prince Sabahaddin, and went on almost at once to speak of the very same subject, the distinction of being and knowing, that we had left at our first talk at Kuru Cheshmi, nearly 2 years before. I made notes of all the talks I had with him, and can therefore reproduce them fairly accurately after all these years. He said, "You have already too much knowledge. It will remain only theory unless you learn to understand not with mind but with heart and body. Now only your mind is awake, your heart and body are asleep. If you continue like this, soon your mind also will go to sleep, and you will never be able to think any new thoughts. You cannot awaken your own feelings, but you can awaken your own body. If you can learn to master your body, you will begin to acquire being. For this you must look on your body as a servant. It must obey you. It is ignorant and lazy. You must teach it to work. If it refuses to work, you must have no mercy on it. Remember yourself as two, you and your body. When you are master of your body, your feelings will obey you. At present, nothing obeys you, not your body, not your feelings, not your thoughts. You cannot start with thoughts because you cannot yet separate yourself from your thoughts. This institute exists to help people to work on themselves. You can work as much or as little as you wish. People come here for various reasons, and they get what they come for. If it is only curiosity, then we arrange things to astonish them. If they come to get knowledge, we have many scientific experiments that will instruct them. But if they come to get being, then they must do the work themselves. No one else can do the work for them, but it is also true that they cannot create the conditions for themselves. Therefore, we create conditions. I said that I was tired of being as I was and wanted to change. He replied, "You must begin at the beginning. You start as kitchen boy, then you will work in the garden, and so on until you have learned how to master your body." He asked me how long I could stay, and I said that I did not know, as it depended on the peace treaty with Turkey. He did not seem very interested and said, "It does not matter. You start now, and we shall see." I was introduced to a middle-aged Russian, Dr. Chernwall. He looked to me a little like Gurdjieff, except that he had a magnificent long beard, but a less impressive head. He showed me my room, a small cell in what had been the servants' quarters of the chateau. The room was scantily furnished and not at all clean. The first day I was left alone and wandered around the grounds. There was a formal garden with water lily pools behind the chateau. Beyond this was a narrow avenue of lime trees, with a broad path in the center and rows of seats on each side facing the lawns. At the far end of the lime trees was a very large circular pool. To the right was the study house, and to the left the stone quarry, destined to become a Russian bath. There were small paddocks with cows, sheep, goats, and a very large hen run, but no pigs. Behind the paddocks in the direction of the Seine, the grounds merged into the forest of Fontainebleau, with large fir trees, beeches, and oaks. A path led away through the wood to an enormous saw pit where planks of timber were being cut. On the third day I became kitchen boy. I guessed that Gurdjieff must have taken some of his ideas from the dervishes, for in the Mevlevi Teki, each future member of the Dedegian passes through 21 stages, in each of which he serves the community. The first task given to the neophyte is that of kitchen boy. I knew nothing about kitchens, or indeed any kind of household work. My first task was to wash the stone floors of the kitchen and scullery. They were very dirty, and I lavished hot water on them, feeling very proud that the dirt was coming away so easily. I suddenly became aware that I had no idea how to remove the water that was flooding the floor. At that moment, Madame Uspensky, a majestic figure dressed entirely in black and with dark chestnut hair and flashing eyes, appeared standing in the doorway, a high step above the floor. I had not seen her since we had met on the island of Principo more than 2 years before. She laughed like a young girl, snatched up a couple of kitchen cloths, and went down on her knees to mop up the water and squeeze it into a pail. I felt very small and incompetent to have been ignorant of so simple a procedure, and at once imitated her action. Every day there were a dozen lessons of the simple kind, in which my practical ignorance and my mental arrogance were painfully knocked together. My kitchen boy duties included that of putting out the breakfast food before 8 a.m., when the people came in from the early morning work. In the first 3 days I learned something about human nature that I had scarcely suspected. The food was scanty and everyone was hungry. The amount of bread, butter, jam, and porridge that I was allowed to put out was enough to satisfy about 2/3 of the people. There was also a particularly unpleasant drink called coffee, made, I believe, with roasted acorns, prepared according to some recipe laid down by Gurdjieff himself. People would come in from work early and take more than their share. Standing beside the tables to collect and wash plates and cutlery, I could watch and listen. I could scarcely believe that the selfishness, indifference, and malevolence, usually so deeply hidden in people, could be so nakedly shown over the simple process of eating breakfast. I began to see what Gurdjieff meant when he said that everything at the Institute provided conditions for work on oneself. One day, I was taken off the scrubbing to spend hours grinding cinnamon in a mortar. I was told that at the time, Gurdjieff was eating nothing but sour cream and powdered cinnamon. Not a day passed without a variety of unexpected, often inexplicable happenings. After a few days, I was transferred to the saw pit. I worked there under Alexander de Salzman. An immense two-handed saw, about 12 feet in length, was handled by one man on a precarious stage, with another deep in the pit. Tree trunks 18 inches in diameter were sawn into planks 3 inches thick. It was grueling work in the heat. If one was above, one had the whole weight of the saw to lift. If one was in the pit, sawdust poured down and stuck on one's sweating face. De Salzman set the pace. He was so skillful in shifting the great logs with the woodsman's hook tool that I asked one of the Russians where he had learned it. He replied with perfect gravity, "He has lived all his life in the Caucasus forests and was a forestry inspector before the war. In point of fact, he had been a famous stage designer in Moscow, and later an associate of Jacques Dalcroze, and had never handled a saw until Gurdjieff had taught him a month before I came. Learning completely new skills in the shortest space of time was part of the training at Gurdjieff's Institute. From the saw pit, I went to the stone quarry, where the mercilessly hard limestone of Fontainebleau Forest was being quarried to build the Russian bath. A burly young Russian named Chekhovovich was in charge of the work. The second day I was on this task, a very large block of limestone broke away. Chekhovovich said it was just what Gurdjieff wanted to make the lintel of the Russian bath. It was far too heavy for us to remove, and we tried to break it up with stone chisels and crowbars. After 2 hours, during which we had made no impression on the stone, Gurdjieff suddenly appeared in his town clothes. I learned later that he had just come from Paris, having been up all night. He did not say a word, but stood on the edge of the pit and watched us. We went on, hacking away at the stone. Abruptly, he took off his coat and, jumping into the pit, took a hammer and chisel from one of the Russian workers. He looked closely at the rock, placed the chisel carefully and tapped 3 or 4 times. He walked half round it, and after a careful examination, tapped again. I am sure he had not struck the rock more than a dozen times when a huge flake, weighing perhaps 100 pounds, cracked off and fell away. He repeated the operation 3 or 4 times, and behold, the slab remained less than half the size of the original. He said, "Lift." We put out all our strength, and the rock came up, and we carried it over to the bath. It was a telling exhibition of skill that has remained in my memory as vividly as when I saw it, but this is only half the story. More than 25 years later, I was sitting beside Gurdjieff at meat in his flat in Paris, and Chekhovovich, now gray and almost bald, was standing facing us. Gurdjieff was talking about jiu-jitsu and saying that he had learned a far more advanced art in Central Asia than that of the Japanese. It was called Fils le Loup, and he had thought of introducing it in Europe and was looking for someone to train as an instructor. As Chekhovovich had been in his youth a champion wrestler, he had been the natural candidate. He then spoke to Chekhovovich and said, "Do you remember at the Prairie, when we were making the Russian bath, how you tried to break the rock for the door frame and could not? I watched you then and saw that you did not know how to look. I could see just where the rock would crack, but you could not see, even when I showed you. So I gave up the idea of teaching Fils le Loup in Europe." Chekhovovich, who adored Gurdjieff as if he were a divine incarnation, stood motionless and said, "Yes, Georgy Ivanitch, I remember." Then tears began to roll down his cheek. I trembled in sympathy. This incident, which had taken 26 years to complete its cycle, was not only characteristic of human ineptitude, but terrifyingly applicable to my own condition. The day's work began at 6 in the morning and continued until 6 at night, with breaks for breakfast and the midday meal. The food was meager and unpalatable, except on Sunday nights when there was a rich feast and open house for visitors. No one who worked at the Priory in 1923 will ever forget the sense of expectancy and wonder with which we awaited each new theme of work given out by Gurdjieff. All went at a breakneck pace. For a few weeks, the theme was based on various kinds and degrees of fasting. Then it would change to psychological tests so penetrating that everyone seemed to be stripped spiritually naked. One example connected with fasting will illustrate the delicacy with which Gurdjieff could give lessons if he chose. There was at the Priory a famous Russian lawyer named Rakhmelievich, who had formerly been the leader of the St. Petersburg Bar before the war. He had joined Gurdjieff in 1911 and was inclined to lay down the law as the senior pupil. Once Gurdjieff came into the drawing room, as he was saying to another Russian, "I should know best what Georgy Ivanitch means, as I have been with him 5 years longer than you." Gurdjieff said quietly, "Rakhmil, if you are not ashamed to say that for yourself, be ashamed for my sake. You expose me as a bad teacher, if after 12 years you have understood so little." Soon after this came the announcement that a course of intensive fasting was to begin. Rakhmelievich secretly hid some food in a tree. Several of us had seen him, but no one said a word. When the fast was due to begin, Gurdjieff told each one what his program was to be. He left Rakhmelievich to the last and then said, "Rakhmelievich need not fast. He already knows too much." I felt a great pang of sorrow as I heard this, for I saw how Rakhmelievich had sacrificed everything to follow Gurdjieff, but could not sacrifice himself. After the fasts, Gurdjieff turned to mental exercises to be combined with the manual labor in the grounds. Gurdjieff's doctrine of conscious labor and intentional suffering was often understood with that cosmic literalness that overtakes Europeans and Americans when they are confronted with Asiatic subtlety. When I arrived at the Priory, the mental exercises took the form of learning long lists of Tibetan words. The ladies, mostly middle-aged Englishwomen, were set to grub up the roots of large trees felled by the men. The task was manifestly impossible, except by digging deep holes or using a winch. The ladies sat in the shallow holes, digging away with small trowels, or even, owing to the endemic lack of tools, with tablespoons, throwing the earth behind them like fowls grubbing on a rubbish heap. Tucked under wristwatches or bracelets were pieces of paper, pulled out surreptitiously every few minutes. The ladies, looking like anxious hens, were muttering the list of words. I wondered as I looked at them what they had come to Fontainebleau to find. Of their sincerity there could be no doubt, but where had they left their common sense? Gurdjieff had ruthless methods of getting rid of those whom he did not want. He seemed to invite and yet to detest a kind of stupid adoration which made his every word and gesture into symbols of some eternal truth. One lady was particularly foolish about him, and he played a cruel trick on her that showed me how seriously we should take his warning to trust nothing and no one, and especially not himself. Every Saturday after lunch, all work was put aside and preparations were made for the weekly fast and reception. In the afternoon, a formal English tea was served on the terrace of the chateau. Once we had ice cream prepared with fresh cream from the Prairie cows. Gurdjieff walked around with a strange, effortless gait that marked him out from any other man. He came up to this lady's table and said, "You not know how to get best taste from ice cream. Should eat with mustard." She dutifully got up and went into the house for a mustard pot. As she returned, Gurdjieff in a thundering voice pointed to her and said, "You see what is round, idiot. She all the time idiot. Why you here?" The poor woman went scarlet and burst into tears. She packed up her bags, went off, and was never seen again. Another time, a young American named Metz, who also suffered from uncritical adoration of Gurdjieff, had been told to put a new headlight on Gurdjieff's car. That night, Gurdjieff had to go to Paris. When his car was taken out and he found the headlight had not been changed, he shouted at Metz to sit on the bumper and hold the light all the way to Paris. Metz meekly sat on the mudguard until Gurdjieff contemptuously pushed him off with his favorite word, "Idiot." A concert pianist named Finch, with most beautiful hands tenderly cared for as if they were priceless treasures, came to stay at the Priory. He was set to look after the hens. As the days passed, he looked more and more anxious. Finally, he said to Gurdjieff that the hens were not laying so well since he took them over. Gurdjieff replied, "Of course not, because you not love them. Hens here know people. They lay for people who love them. must learn to love them. The next day I passed the hen house and saw a poor finch gazing into the run, evidently bent upon loving the hens, but quite unable to guess how it was done. Every evening after dinner, a new life began. There was no hurry. Some walked in the garden, others smoked. About 9 o'clock, we made our way alone or in twos and threes to the study house. Outdoor shoes came off, and soft shoes or moccasins were put on. We sat quietly, each on his or her own cushion, round the floor in the center. Men sat on the right, women on the left, never together. Some went straight onto the stage and began to practice the rhythmic exercises. On our first arrival, each of us had the right to choose his own teacher for the movements. I had chosen Vasily Farapontov, a young Russian, tall, with a sad, studious face. He wore pince nez and looked the picture of the perpetual student Trofimov in The Cherry Orchard. He was a conscientious instructor, though not a brilliant performer. I came to value his friendship, which continued until his premature death 10 years later. He told me in one of our first conversations that he expected to die young. The exercises were much the same as those I had seen in Constantinople 3 years before. The new pupils, such as myself, began with a series called 6 obligatory exercises. I found them immensely exciting and worked hard to master them quickly so that I could join in the work of the general class. At that time, Gurdjieff was preparing a special class composed almost exclusively of Russians to give public demonstrations. The general class could learn any new exercises, but did not take part in the special training reserved for the demonstration class. Gurdjieff's method of creating new exercises had a living spontaneity that was one secret of his success as a teacher. While the new pupils were practicing on the stage, some of the Russians would gather around the piano, where Thomas de Hartmann sat with his bald head perked like a bird. Gurdjieff would begin to tap a rhythm on the piano top. When it was clear to all, he hummed a melody or played it with one hand on the piano and then walked away. Hartmann would develop a theme to fit the rhythm and the melody. If he went wrong, Gurdjieff would shout at him, and Hartmann would shout furiously back. Then the older class would line up in rows, and we would stand on the side and watch, or go back to our places on the floor. Gurdjieff would teach the postures and gestures of the exercises, partly by doing them himself, or if they were complicated, involving different movements by different rows or positions, he would walk around and place each pupil in the desired posture. There would be vehement arguments. The stage became a chaos of dispute, gesticulation, and shouting as the pupils tried to work out the sequence required. Suddenly, Gurdjieff would give a peremptory shout, and there would be dead silence. A few words of explanation, and Hartmann would begin to play the theme, which by then he had worked out into a rich harmony. Sometimes the result was spectacular. A beautiful ensemble, never seen before, would appear as if by magic. At other times, the task was too difficult and the exercise broke down, to be worked over for hours during the succeeding days. In addition to the set exercises, many hours were spent in performing rhythms with the feet to music improvised by Hartmann. Sometimes also, Gurdjieff used his famous stop exercise. At any moment of the day or night, he might shout, "Stop!" when everyone within hearing had to arrest all movement. First, the eyes were to fix upon the object of their gaze. The body was to remain motionless in the exact posture of the moment the word "stop" was heard, and the thought present in the mind was to be held. In short, every voluntary movement was to be arrested and held. The stop might last a few seconds, or 5, 10 minutes, or more. The posture might be painful, or even dangerous, but if we were sincere and conscientious, we would do nothing to ease it. We had to wait until Gurdjieff shouted, "Dave," or "Continue," and then resume what we had been doing before. The rhythmic exercises were often so complicated and unnatural that I despaired of learning them. And yet, again and again, a minor miracle occurred. After hours of fruitless and maddening struggle, the body would suddenly give way, and the impossible movement would be made. The work in the study house always continued until midnight, and often much later, so that we seldom had more than 3 or 4 hours sleep before starting the morning's work. About midnight, Gurdjieff would call out, "Kto хочет спать? Может идти спать," or "Who wants sleep, go sleep." One or two would get up and go out, but the great majority remained. knowing that often the most interesting explanations and demonstrations were given after the regular work was done. Sometimes Gurdjieff gave lectures. These were very great events, for everyone was avid for a better understanding of all the strange things that were happening to us. I can repeat one lecture verbatim. One evening, Major Pinder, a former British intelligence officer who had met Gurdjieff in Tiflis in 1919, and who, knowing Russian very well, acted as his interpreter, announced that there was to be a lecture. We all went to the study house as usual, but instead of practicing the exercises, sat expectantly round the hall on our cushions. Time passed. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight. At last Gurdjieff arrived, evidently having driven out from Paris, accompanied by Madame Ostrowska, Madame Uspensky, and Major Pinder. He stood and looked at us all for a long time and said in English, "Patience is the mother of will. If you have not a mother, how can you be born?" He then walked out of the study house. This lecture made a very strong impression on me, because I knew that I was lacking equally in patience and in will. I can only record a few incidents out of dozens that happened every day to produce an extraordinary state of tension, in which people were stripped of all the psychological protections by which we live in our usual world. Some people went mad. There were even suicides. Many gave up in despair. Some were so lost in their private dreams that they scarcely noticed the extraordinary conditions in which we were living. After about a fortnight of this life, I began to feel very ill, chiefly from a return of the dysentery from which I had suffered in Smyrna 4 years before. I took literally what Gurdjieff said about disregarding the objections of my body, and forced myself to work even harder than the others. At that time there was a prolonged drought, and every evening we all had to help in watering the kitchen garden, upon which we depended for a good part of our food. I noticed an ample stream flowing only 100 yards from the kitchen garden, and that the level of the water would allow it to be used for irrigation. I mentioned this to several of the pupils who, without exception, were shocked at the very suggestion that we might devise something to lighten our work. One day Gurdjieff came up to the kitchen garden, and with considerable trepidation I asked him if I could make an irrigation canal of the kind used in Anatolia. He agreed without discussion. The next day I built a dam and started cutting a canal, but as it had to pass over some higher ground, I saw that it would take me weeks to dig it in the little spare time I had after lunch. However, I reckoned without Gurdjieff. The same evening he came up to the kitchen garden and made a great scene about the stupidity of carrying water when a stream was so near. Everyone was set to digging canals, and the irrigation system was working the next day. Afterwards I heard Gurdjieff describe it as a special system that he had seen in Persia, and it became one of the marvels of the Prieuré, shown to visitors as an example of Gurdjieff's uncanny wisdom. Each morning it was harder and harder to get out of bed, and my body shrank from the heavy work and the heat of the sun. The constant diarrhea made me very weak, but somehow I kept going. Finally a day came when I simply could not stand up. I was shaking with fever and very wretched in myself, feeling that I had failed. Just as I was saying to myself, "I will stay in bed today," I felt my body rising. I dressed and went to work as usual, but this time with a queer sense of being held together by a superior will which was not my own. We worked as usual all the morning. I could not eat lunch that day, but lay on the ground wondering if I was going to die. Gurdjieff had just introduced afternoon practice of the exercises, out of doors under the lime grove. When the pupils began to collect under the lime trees, I joined them. Gurdjieff and Hartmann came out together. The piano was carried out from the study house by 6 men. I was one of them, and I stumbled, nearly bringing the others down. I was hot and miserable. We started by working on a new exercise of incredible complexity that even the most experienced Russian pupils could not master. The structure of the exercises was drawn on the board in symbols, and head, feet, arms, and torso had to follow independent sequences. It was a torture for all of us. Gurdjieff pretended to be angry and stopped us, saying we must practice rhythms. Hartmann began to play one rhythm after another, which had to be followed with the feet. I felt very ill and weak. A deadly lassitude took possession of me, so that every movement became a supreme effort of will. One of the English pupils stopped and sat down, then another and another. Soon I ceased to be aware of anything but the music and my own weakness. I kept saying to myself, "At the next change I will stop." Hartman went on and on. One by one, all the English pupils fell out, and most of the Russian women. Only 6 or 7 men, and I believe Jean de Salzman continued. Gurdjieff stood watching intently. Time lost the quality of before and after. There was no past and no future, only the present agony of making my body move. Gradually, I became aware that Gurdjieff was putting all his attention on me. There was an unspoken demand. There was at the same time an encouragement and a promise. I must not give up if it killed me. Suddenly I was filled with the influx of an immense power. My body seemed to have turned into light. I could not feel its presence in the usual ways. There was no effort, no pain, no weariness, not even sense of weight. I felt an intense gratitude towards Gurdjieff and Thomas de Hartmann, but they had quietly gone off, having dismissed the class and leaving me quite alone. My own state was blissful beyond anything I had ever known. It was quite different from the ecstasy of sexual union, for it was altogether free and detached from the body. It was exultation in the faith that can move mountains. All had gone into the house for tea, but I went in the opposite direction, towards the kitchen garden, where I took a spade and began to dig. Digging in the earth is a searching test of our capacity for physical effort. A strong man can dig very fast for a short time, or slowly for a long time, but no one can force his body to dig fast for a long time, even if he has exceptional training. I felt the need to test the power that had entered me, and I began to dig in the fierce afternoon heat for more than an hour at a rate that I ordinarily could not sustain for 2 minutes. I felt no fatigue and no sense of effort. My weak, rebellious, suffering body had become strong and obedient. The diarrhea had ceased, and I no longer felt the gnawing abdominal pains that had been with me for days. Moreover, I experienced a clarity of thought that I had only known involuntarily and at rare moments, but which now was at my command. I returned in thought to the Grande Rue de Paris and discovered that I could be aware of the 5th dimension. The phrase, "in my mind's eye," took on new meaning, as I saw the eternal pattern of each thing I looked at. The trees, the plants, the water flowing in the canal, and even the spade, and lastly, my own body. I recognized the changing relationship between myself and my pattern. As my state of consciousness changed, I and my pattern grew closer together or separated and lost touch. Time and eternity were the conditions of our experience, and the harmonious development of man towards which Gurdjieff was leading us was the secret of true freedom. I remember saying aloud, "Now I see why God hides himself from us." But even now I cannot recall the intuition behind this exclamation. Gurdjieff had said to me at our first meeting at Kuru Cheshmi that it is not enough to know that another world exists. One must be able to enter it at will. Now I was living in eternity, and yet I had not lost my hold on time. I was aware that life itself is infinitely richer and greater than all that our thinking mind can possibly know about it. As the pupils began to return to the garden to begin the evening watering, I left my digging and wandered into the forest. I went past the stone quarry, past the saw pit, along a path that led up the hill behind Avon. The great trees, the gray rocks, the cloudless sky, and the murmur of evening insects all blended with my inner life. There was no distinction of outside and inside. Everything was where it was, and so was neither inside nor outside of anything else. I no longer wished to test anything or prove anything. I was satisfied to be just as I was. Turning a bend in the path, where there was a big gray rock, I met Gurdjieff. Our meeting seemed inevitable, although I had never been in that part of the forest before. Without any preliminaries, he began to talk about the energies that work in man. There is a certain energy that is necessary for work on oneself. One man can make efforts unless he has a supply. No man can make efforts unless he has a supply of this energy. We can call it the higher emotional energy. Everyone, by a natural process, makes a small amount of this energy every day. If rightly used, it enables man to achieve much for his own self-perfecting, but he can only get to a certain point in this way. The real, complete transformation of being that is indispensable for a man who wishes to fulfill the purpose of his existence requires a very much greater concentration of higher emotional energy than that which comes to him by nature. There are some people in the world, but they are very rare, who are connected to a great reservoir or accumulator of this energy. This reservoir has no limits. Those who can draw upon it can be a means of helping others. Suppose that the man needs 100 units of this energy for his own transformation, but he only has 10 units and cannot make more for himself. He is helpless, but with the help of someone who can draw upon the great accumulator, he can borrow 90 more. Then his work can be effective. He let all this sink in and then stopped, and looking into my eyes said, "Those who have this quality belong to a special part of the highest caste of humanity. It may be that one day you will become such, but you will have to wait for many years. What you have received today is a taste of what is possible for you. Until now, you have only known about these things theoretically, but now you have experience. When a man has had experience of reality, he is responsible for what he does with his life." He added that in a day or two, he would speak to me about his plans for the future and tell me how I could find a place in them if I wished to do so. I felt no need to ask any questions. For the moment, I had lost all interest in knowing more, and was content to live with the experience that had so wonderfully come to me. Gurdjieff went off, saying no more, and I continued to walk in the forest. A lecture of Ouspensky came into my mind. He had spoken about the very narrow limits within which we can control our functions, and added, "It is easy to verify that we have no control over our emotions. Some people imagine that they can be angry or pleased as they will, but anyone can verify that he cannot be astonished at will." As I recalled these words, I said to myself, "I will be astonished." Instantly, I was overwhelmed with amazement, not only at my own state, but at everything that I looked at or thought of. Each tree was so uniquely itself that I felt that I could walk in the forest forever and never cease from wonderment. Then the thought of fear came to me. At once I was shaking with terror. Unnamed horrors were menacing me on every side. I thought of joy, and I felt that my heart would burst from rapture. The word love came to me, and I was pervaded with such fine shades of tenderness and compassion that I saw that I had not the remotest idea of the depth and range of love. Love was everywhere and in everything. It was infinitely adaptable to every shade of need. After a time, it became too much for me. It seemed that if I plunged any more deeply into the mystery of love, I would cease to exist. I wanted to be free from this power to feel whatever I chose, and at once it left me. As it went, and I began to see again with my own eyes and think with my own thoughts, a distich of Blake's spoke itself to me. "Grown old in love from 7 till 7 times 7, I have oft wished for hell for change from heaven." I realized that for Blake this was no mere trick of words, but the expression of a real experience. I knew that the world I had entered was one where there is no loneliness, because all who enter into that eternal source meet there as brothers. Everything had become quiet and clear. I was aware of my body, but it was completely outside. I remembered perfectly clearly my experience in the casualty clearing station on 21st March 1918. I had just the same awareness that it would not in the least matter if my body were destroyed. That evening in the study house, we worked at the same complicated exercise that had completely baffled me the same afternoon. I saw instantly how it should be done. One rhythm could be done by the intelligence present in my body. For another, I needed only to hear the music and let it guide me. There was a third that I could carry in my mind. The unity of the movement came from the state of feeling that it expressed. Because I was able to separate these 3 different powers in myself, I could follow the whole pattern without effort. The pattern could not pass from the mind to the body, as I had been trying to make it do. I do not wish anyone to notice that I could do the exercise, and this interested me also, because I was well aware of the silly vanity which usually made me sensitive to my successes or failures in front of others. Before long, Gurdjieff stopped the exercises and had the big blackboard placed in position for a lecture. He proceeded to draw an intricate diagram, consisting of a schematic representation of the human body and their principal functions. To this he added a mechanism that looked like shafts and pulleys of various sizes. He then gave a lecture in Russian. At that time, I found myself following all that he was saying, and even noticing when Pindar made mistakes in translation. I understood that Gurdjieff was showing how our capacity for work depends upon the way we are connected with the sources of energy inside us and beyond us. All that he said illuminated my own experience. Gurdjieff's explanations reached me in a direct way, as if they came from inside myself, rather than through his words in my hearing. The significance of what he was saying went far beyond my own situation. I saw a picture of all humanity thirsting for the energy that was flowing through me. Gurdjieff spoke of the great eternal reservoirs which are connected with sacred beings who have come to the earth to help mankind. He then passed to another diagram showing how the will of God in creation acts through energies of different density of fineness. I could see that such sources of help are really present, and was aware of the great mistake that we men have made in breaking the contact that we could have with them. After the lecture, the pupils dispersed and went to bed. I went out into the garden. The air was still hot and the night was brilliant. Sleep was impossible. Once again, unexpectedly, Gurdjieff met me on the path. He said nothing but, "Now time go sleep," in English. I protested in Turkish that I could not sleep. He replied that I could, and that I would lose nothing by sleeping. I went to bed and slept immediately. The next morning, nothing was left of the experience but memory, and the conviction that someday, somehow, I must not only taste, but make my own, the power to connect myself with the great accumulator that could endow man with such marvelous powers. There was an interesting sequel to Gurdjieff's lecture, for the next day, Maurice Nicole and others came to me to say that they had not understood what Gurdjieff was driving at, but felt that somehow I had been able to follow him. When I tried to explain, I found myself quite unable to remember a word of his lecture, or speak of what had happened to me the previous day. It had been the most extraordinary and important day of my whole life, but it could not be shared with others. I was able to reconstruct his diagram, which enabled me, in writing the dramatic universe 30 years later, to give an interpretation of the creative process that would otherwise have been quite beyond my understanding. 2 or 3 days after this great experience, Gurdjieff invited me one morning to drive with him to Milan, where he had business. On our return, he turned the car into a forest track, and we came out in a clearing, 100 feet or more above the Chateau de Prieuré. He told me that this was his favorite view, and as we sat together on a seat, he spoke to me of his plan for buying more land and building an observatory. He said that there were many facts about the movements of the planets which astronomical science overlooked, and he wished to continue researches that had started in Central Asia 30 years before. I had no idea how old he was, and assumed that he might be 60 or 70 years old, though he looked much younger. He spoke of himself at one moment as an old man, and at another would boast of his youthfulness and virility. It was impossible to tell when he was speaking seriously and when he was trying one out with some flight of outrageous fancy. Anyhow, I took his plans for an observatory and center for scientific researches quite seriously. It fitted into my own dreams, and I did not ask myself if perhaps Gurdjieff were making a fool of me. I returned to the Prieuré feeling very important because Gurdjieff had let me into his secret plans. A letter was waiting for me, giving news I had been hoping for, that Mrs. Beaumont was arriving in 2 days. I had been writing and urging her to come. Gurdjieff had asked about her and told me to assure her that she would be welcome, but for some reason that I could not understand, she had been hesitating. It transpired that the reason was very simple. I had painted such a picture of the strenuous life at the Prieuré that she felt she would not be strong enough to stand it, and did not want to hold me back. When she did arrive toward the end of August, Gurdjieff welcomed her personally and told her to stay as long as she wished. However, when she saw me, she was alarmed. She was also shocked to see that the Russian doctor who was giving me injections for dysentery had no care for the rudiments of hygiene, but would come straight from the cow byre with dirty hands to use an unsterilized syringe. Indeed, the whole state of the Prieuré horrified her. When she went into the kitchen and saw it black with flies, she went straight out to the village and bought dozens of fly papers and hung them up herself. The English visitors looked at her askance. It had been taken for granted that the flies in the kitchen were a test with which we had to bear. She also antagonized the Russians by her apparent lack of respect for Gurdjieff. He himself was delighted, and went out of his way to praise her for being sensible enough to fight with the flies. Within a few days of the great experience, my dysentery had returned, and I was feeling weaker than ever. Mrs. Beaumont insisted on taking me away to Paris for a rest. Within a day or two, I felt much stronger, and having nothing to do, I decided to try out Gurdjieff's recipe for learning Russian. He had said at dinner one evening that the way he learned languages was to set himself to memorize 200 words a day, making sure each morning that he had not forgotten the previous lists. At that time, there were benches in the Champs-Élysées from the Rond Point up to the Etoile. When I saw that there were 20, I decided to learn 10 words on each bench and then pass on to the next. I chose 200 words from Bondar's Russian grammar and started. The first day I learned the list in 2 hours. The second day it took me 6 hours. On the third day, I had a violent headache and had to abandon the attempt, having learned 500 words in all. However, I found to my surprise and delight that with this foundation I could now read Russian and understand what was said to me. Meanwhile, I had a letter from John Decay urging me to go to London as soon as possible, as he had heard that Lord Curzon was leaving the Foreign Office, and we might expect a more friendly attitude toward the Turkish claims. I went back to the Priory the next morning, feeling much better in health, but very unsettled in spirit. I was suffering a reaction after the prodigious experiences of the week before. Gurdjieff saw me that day. I told him about John Decay and his hopes, and added that if the claims of the Abdul Hamid heirs were recognized, I should have enough money to help him to build his observatory. In the meantime, I had nothing. Also, I needed to help my mother, for my father had died penniless, having lost her money as well as his own. I had other obligations, and it was necessary to make some money. I would have wished to stay at the Priory, where I had found what mattered to me most in life. He said to me, "So far you have come here as a trial. You have been given something, but if you come here to work, you must understand that nothing is given. If you wish to acquire something of your own, you must learn to steal. What I have to give cannot be paid for. It is priceless. Therefore, if you need it, you must steal it. You have the possibility of learning to work. The truth is that very few people in the contemporary world have this possibility. For more people, there are barriers that they cannot pass. Everyone has these barriers. They are in human nature. You have seen that it is possible to be directly connected with the great accumulator of energy that is the source of all miracles. If you could be permanently connected with this source, you could pass all barriers. But you do not know how it is done, and you are not ready to be shown. Everything is still in front of you to be done, but you now have the proof that it is possible. It may take 20, 30, or even 40 years before you will be able to enter into the possession of the power that was lent to you for a day. But what is a whole lifetime is such a thing as possible. Ever since I was a young boy, I have known of the existence of this power and of the barriers that separate man from it, and I searched until I found the way of breaking through them. This is the greatest secret that man can discover about human nature. Many people are convinced that they wish to be free and to know reality, but they do not know the barrier that prevents them from reaching reality. They came to me for help, but they are unwilling to or unable to pay the price. It is not my fault if I cannot help them. He spoke again about being in knowledge and the danger for me of losing everything if I relied on knowledge alone. He said grimly, "With too much knowledge, the inner barrier may become insurmountable." I said, "If I should stay with you, how much time would be needed?" In view of what he had just said, I expected him to tell me that it would take 20 years, but he replied, "If you will devote all your energies to the task, it may take 2 years before you can work alone. Until then you will need me, for you cannot create the conditions for yourself. But afterwards you will not need me anymore. But for those 2 years you must be ready for anything." When I reminded him that I had no money and that I could not stay without paying, he replied, "I am not interested in your money, but in your work. There are plenty of people who will give me money, but very few who will work. I will give you the money you need. I shall soon go to America and you can help me, if you will learn Russian and be my interpreter. Soon you will learn to give lectures in the way I require. At present, you will have to take, because you have nothing to give. Later, you will be ready to give your last shirt to help the work, as I am ready to give mine." Gurdjieff was facing me with a great decision, but I knew that I could not accept his offer. I told myself that I would go away and make money, and then I would return. He did not ask me to decide anything. Having said what he was prepared to do, he seemed to lose all interest in me. I could not even find him to say goodbye. It was at the beginning of September 1923 that I walked for the last time up the hill to the station of Fontainebleau and took the train for Paris. A chapter had been closed, and nothing was to be written in it until I returned to him. I was very far from foreseeing that 25 years were to pass before I met Gurdjieff again. It was only after Gurdjieff reached the end of his life that I became aware that the pattern of his own life required him to drive away all those who could be the most useful to him. He drove away from him P.D. Uspensky, Alexander de Salzman, and even his most devoted friend Thomas de Hartmann. He also drove away A.R. Orage, Maurice Nicole, and many others. None of these was ever able to return, though several tried. I was most fortunate in being able to go back to Gurdjieff. This was certainly through no merit of my own, but probably because I was much younger than the others, and 25 years later was still alive to take another chance.